Imagine living in 1951, when jet aviation was the ultimate symbol of modernity, and suddenly the world's largest automaker unveils a car that looks more like a fighter jet than an automobile. Its name? GM LeSabre. More than a car, it was a rolling laboratory, a dream of the future materialized. Today, we're diving into this icon, understanding why it was so important and how it still fascinates classic car enthusiasts. The year was 1951. The world was still breathing the air of the post-war era, and the American automotive industry was about to undergo a radical transformation. The streets were filled with robust, heavy cars, with conservative lines and mechanics derived from the previous decade. But in the skies, something new caught the eye: military jets. Elegant, fast, and powerful machines, they had become the ultimate symbol of human progress. It was in this setting that Harley Earl, the legendary head of design at General Motors, decided it was time to take the language of aviation to the roads. The result of this visionary thinking would be the GM LeSabre, a car that not only looked like it came from the future, but also incorporated technologies that would only appear decades later in production vehicles. The central idea was bold: to create a car that was more than just a static show prototype, something that could actually drive, accelerate, take on corners, and be seen cruising on public roads. Harley Earl wanted a functional automobile, a true rolling laboratory. Unlike most concepts of the time, which were meant only for display, the LeSabre was designed to be used daily. And indeed it was. For a time, Earl himself drove the car as if it were part of his life, bringing futuristic imagination to the streets of America. The goal wasn't to compete for sales or win a specific group of buyers. The LeSabre had a different role: to serve as a technological and aesthetic showcase. It was a clear message to the world that GM was ready to lead not only in the market, but in the collective imagination. The target audience was journalists, executives, engineers, and enthusiasts. It was their opinions that would shape the acceptance of new trends, and GM knew they needed to impress. The LeSabre was born to spark dreams, provoke debates, and, above all, define the course of automotive design in the decades that followed. But building such an advanced car in 1951 was no simple task. The first challenge lay in the materials. The automotive industry worked with heavy steel, ideal for mass production, but unsuitable for a concept that needed to be light, agile, and visually bold. The solution was innovative: to use aluminum, magnesium, and even fiberglass in its body. This combination, unheard of at the time, not only reduced weight, but also allowed for the creation of curved and daring shapes that would have been impossible with stamped steel. It was a technological leap that showed GM's determination to go beyond the conventional. The design of the LeSabre was a spectacle in itself. The front featured a grille inspired by jet turbines, giving the impression that the car could take off at any moment. The headlights, hidden behind movable grilles, added an air of mystery and modernity, functioning as if they were part of a living machine. The rear displayed prominent fins, evoking the tail surfaces of military jets. Every line of the car seemed sculpted to convey speed, even when standing still. The wraparound windshield was one of the first of its kind, creating a panoramic and futuristic view for the driver and passengers. Decades later, this style would be widely copied by the industry. Another crucial challenge was combining bold design with practical engineering. It was necessary to ensure that the car wasn't just an object of display, but a vehicle capable of running reliably. This required creative solutions in cooling, structure, and suspension. GM equipped the LeSabre with an experimental propulsion system that included a supercharged V8 engine prepared to run on both gasoline and methanol. This dual-fuel idea was completely visionary, anticipating concerns that wouldn't become part of the debate on energy efficiency and performance until much later. The impact of the LeSabre was immediate. When displayed, it looked more like a science fiction prototype than a real car. For the specialized press, it was a reality check. The future everyone imagined was already here, running, accelerating, and proving that imagination could materialize. For GM executives, it was the confirmation of their investment in design and innovation. For enthusiasts, it was the confirmation that the automotive industry could indeed break barriers and create something that was completely out of the ordinary. In summary, the birth of the GM LeSabre was the union of three powerful forces: the aesthetic inspiration of jet aviation, Harley Earl's desire to materialize a tangible future, and GM's technical ability to experiment fearlessly. The result was a car that had no direct rivals because it didn't compete in markets, it competed in the imagination. And in that field, it was unbeatable. If in design, the LeSabre already looked like a car from a futuristic dream, in terms of engineering, it was even bolder. Harley Earl and his team didn't just want a beautiful automobile for display. They had the mission of turning the car into a true experimental laboratory on wheels, testing technologies that might or might not reach the market at some point in the future. Every detail was meant to impress, provoke, and, above all, inspire. The heart of the LeSabre was its engine. At a time when six-cylinder inline engines dominated production cars and V8s were still under development, the LeSabre already boasted an all-aluminum V8 engine, with 3.5 liters of displacement and equipped with a supercharger. The result was simply astounding: 335 horsepower and 381 pound-feet of torque, numbers far above any street car available at the beginning of the 1950s. To put that into perspective, the most powerful production cars of the time barely reached 160 or 170 horsepower. The LeSabre therefore doubled that threshold. But what made this engine even more innovative was the dual fuel concept. It could run on both gasoline and methanol, automatically switching between the two carburetors as needed. Under normal use, it ran on gasoline, but under high demand, when the supercharger came into play, the system would activate the methanol carburetor, ensuring greater power and reducing the risk of detonation. This type of solution was extremely advanced and would only be discussed practically many decades later in competition projects and studies on biofuels.
The transmission was also ahead of its time. While many cars still relied on 3-speed manual gearboxes, the LeSabre featured a 4-speed automatic transmission with a torque converter, something reserved for top-tier prototypes. This choice showed a concern with combining performance with convenience, anticipating the trend that would dominate the American market in the following years. Another point of distinction was the suspension. At the front, the car used unequal-length A-arms and torsion bars, a sophisticated solution to ensure stability and comfort. At the rear, a de Dion axle, far more advanced than the common rigid axles, allowed for better traction while reducing lateral movement, offering superior dynamic behavior. All of this was complemented by tubular hydraulic shock absorbers, whereas many cars of the time still used rudimentary systems. The dimensions also reinforced the boldness of the design. The LeSabre was over 5 meters long, 2 meters wide, and just 1.27 meters high. This combination created a low and wide profile resembling a fighter jet on the ground, conveying stability and imposing presence. The weight, despite the large dimensions, was around 1,700 kilograms, thanks to the extensive use of aluminum and magnesium in the bodywork and chassis.
But perhaps the biggest impact wasn't just in the mechanics. The LeSabre came with a host of technological innovations never seen in a car. The electrical system, for example, was 12 volts, something that wouldn't become standard until years later. This advance allowed for more powerful and reliable accessories. The retractable headlights were hidden behind movable grills, making it seem as though the car was breathing. The convertible top had an automatic rain sensor. A single drop on the windshield would trigger the mechanism to close the top without any driver intervention. And perhaps the most impressive of all, the car had hydraulic jacks built into the chassis. Imagine parking, pressing a button, and seeing the car lift itself so you could change a tire, something that seemed pure science fiction in the 1950s. These technologies weren't just there to impress. They were a way to test the viability of systems that could later migrate, in simplified versions, to production models. Some of these ideas indeed became commonplace in the following decades, such as the 12-volt electrical system and the use of retractable headlights in sports models. Others, like the built-in hydraulic jacks, remained restricted to the world of prototypes, but still marked an era. From a performance standpoint, the LeSabre was estimated to reach nearly 200 kilometers per hour, an extraordinary feat for a car of its size at the time. The acceleration from 0 to 100 kilometers per hour was around 8.5 seconds, once again putting the prototype on a nearly sports car level, at a time when European sports cars like Ferrari and Jaguar dominated that performance range. In short, the LeSabre wasn't just a beautiful car. It was an engineering manifesto, a collection of radical technologies brought together in a single vehicle. Harley Earl wanted to prove that design and mechanics could go hand in hand, and he succeeded. With every detail, from the engine to the automatic top, the LeSabre made it clear that it wasn't just a sculpture, but a real car, functional, capable of driving, accelerating, and above all, pointing the way to the future. When we talk about automotive legacy, few concept cars have had the same relevance as the GM LeSabre. It was never mass-produced, never competed in sales, and never had a direct rival on the streets. Still, its influence spanned entire decades, shaped the aesthetics of a generation, and left deep marks that still extend today. The LeSabre wasn't just a car, it was a game-changer. The immediate impact was aesthetic. In the 1950s, automotive design underwent a radical transformation. Conservative lines gave way to bold curves, abundant chrome, and, above all, the famous rear fins, which became synonymous with the American automotive culture of the time. The LeSabre was one of the first cars to incorporate these fins so prominently, directly inspiring production models that would come in the following years, not just from Buick, but from all GM divisions. The very name LeSabre would return in 1959 as a Buick production line, carrying with it some of the prestige and futuristic aura created by the original concept. But the LeSabre also brought innovations that changed the technical side of the market. The 12-volt electrical system, introduced in the prototype, was eventually adopted by the industry as a standard. The wraparound windshield became a trend in the 1950s and 1960s. And the hidden headlights, which in the LeSabre were almost theatrical, would later be seen in iconic models like the Corvette and several muscle cars in the following decades. It's important to note that the LeSabre wasn't seen as a car far from reality. On the contrary, the public saw it as a preview of tomorrow. It was part of the GM Motoramas, the traveling exhibitions of General Motors that toured the United States, showcasing their dream cars to the public. At these events, the LeSabre was always the main attraction. At each event, crowds gathered to see up close that automobile that seemed like a fusion of car and jet, a piece of science fiction turned into reality. And there was also the human factor. Harley Earl, its creator, didn't settle for leaving the LeSabre in the stands. He himself used it as his personal car for about 2 years. It was common to see Earl arriving at events or even driving it on public roads with the concept. This had a huge impact. Imagine being an ordinary passerby in the 50s and suddenly encountering a car that looked like a spaceship cruising beside you. It was as if the future had descended to Earth for a few moments. Today, the one and only example of the LeSabre belongs to the GM Heritage Center, a space dedicated to preserving the history of General Motors. It is carefully maintained and occasionally displayed at elegance concours and historical exhibitions. It is considered one of the most valuable gems in GM's collection, not just for its material value, but for the symbolic weight it carries. There is no other authentic example. This means that, in the world, only one original LeSabre exists. Replicas have been attempted by enthusiasts, but none managed to faithfully convey the mix of audacity, materials, and stage presence of the original. And how much would this car be worth today if it were put up for auction? It's difficult to calculate. As a unique piece, it has no conventional market price. But experts believe that if it were auctioned, it could easily reach figures in the millions of dollars, possibly surpassing $10 million, not for its performance or luxury, but for its historical importance. In this sense, the LeSabre is more comparable to a work of art than to a classic car. In addition to the technical and aesthetic impact, the LeSabre carries fascinating curiosities. Its name was directly inspired by the F-86 Sabre jet fighter, one of the symbols of North American air supremacy. Its built-in hydraulic jacks were so futuristic that they seemed like magic. With the press of a button, the car would lift itself to allow for tire changes without any effort. Its engine, with the ability to switch between gasoline and methanol, anticipated discussions that wouldn't return to the forefront until much later, such as alternative fuels and energy flexibility. Even the rain sensor for closing the top, a seemingly mundane detail today, sounded like pure science fiction in 1951. What's most impressive, however, is realizing that despite all these innovations, the LeSabre was fully functional. It wasn't a mock-up, it wasn't a sculpture. It was a car that drove, accelerated, and could be used every day. Few concepts in automotive history had this kind of courage. And it was this boldness that earned it the status of a legend. Among enthusiasts, the LeSabre is revered as a milestone. It symbolizes a time when automakers dared to dream big, unafraid to push limits. Today, when we talk about concept cars, we inevitably think back to 1951 and remember the LeSabre as a reference. It wasn't just GM's car of the future, it was the car that taught the world that the future could be designed, built, and even driven. In summary, the legacy of the LeSabre lies in its ability to inspire. It didn't leave a production line, but it left a line of thought. It didn't generate thousands of units, but it generated thousands of ideas. And perhaps that's its greatest victory, proving that sometimes a single car can forever change the way we see the automotive industry.